The most exclusive chess club in Manhattan smelled of aged leather, expensive cologne, and the quiet, intoxicating scent of old money. On the 43rd floor of a midtown skyscraper, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, below a glittering sprawl of ambition and consequence that stretched all the way to the horizon. Crystal chandeliers hung above hand-polished mahogany tables. Each chess set on display was worth more than most people's monthly rent, carved from Italian marble and ebony wood. The pieces weighted and balanced to a standard that only true connoisseurs would notice. The Meridian Chess Club was not merely a place to play a game. It was a stage, and on that stage, wealth announced itself loudly, proudly, and without apology. On a Thursday evening in late October, the club filled steadily with the kind of people who traveled in black cars and never once checked a price tag. Investment bankers in tailored Brioni suits arrived with the practiced ease of those accustomed to rooms that demanded a certain standard. A hedge fund manager gestured broadly at the bar while two young associates laughed on cue. A real estate developer, gray-haired and barrel-chested, greeted the host with the overfamiliarity of a man who had donated enough to have his name on a wall somewhere. Watches glinted under the chandelier light: Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Rolex, each one a small, quiet declaration of where a person stood in the world. The air hummed with the low murmur of people performing for each other, a theater of affluence where the script had been written long before any of them walked through the door. That was when the elevator doors opened and a man walked in alone. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had lived in it, not weathered by hardship exactly, but shaped by years of quiet focus and the particular solitude of a man who had learned to rely entirely on himself. He wore dark trousers, clean and pressed but unremarkable, and a charcoal jacket that had seen better days, its elbows faintly worn, its cut several seasons behind whatever currently hung in the boutiques of Fifth Avenue. He carried no briefcase. He wore no watch that anyone could see. He moved through the entrance with the calm, measured steps of someone who had no interest in being noticed, signed his name at the registration desk without ceremony, and found a seat at one of the back tables near the tournament board. His name was Daniel Mercer. The whispers started almost immediately. A woman in a sleeveless gown leaned toward the man beside her, one gloved hand raised to shield her mouth. A cluster of men near the bar exchanged sideways glances. The host, Marcus, a slim and immaculately groomed man in his early 50s, approached the registration desk with a faint crease between his brows and reviewed the sign-in sheet with the expression of a man trying to solve a polite problem. Daniel had registered for the evening's friendly tournament, a round-robin event held monthly for members and invited guests. Marcus looked up, studied Daniel for a moment, then looked back down at the sheet. The registration fee had been paid. The form was correctly filled. He stamped the entry card without further comment, though the crease between his brows did not entirely disappear. A younger man in a navy blazer approached Daniel with the studied nonchalance of someone delivering a message they found amusing. "Are you with the catering staff?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearby tables. "I think they enter through the service corridor on the left." Two people laughed. Daniel looked up from the board he had been studying, met the young man's gaze with an expression of complete and unruffled calm, and said, quietly and without any edge, "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." He looked back at the board. The young man lingered for a moment, apparently expecting something more: embarrassment, perhaps, or deflection, and when nothing came, he drifted away with the faintly unsatisfied air of someone whose joke had landed in a room with no echo. What none of them knew, what none of them had any reason to suspect, was the interior life of the man sitting quietly at that back table. Daniel Mercer had grown up in a small apartment in Queens, the son of a postal worker and a part-time librarian, and he had discovered chess at the age of 7, when his father brought home a cracked plastic board from a church rummage sale. Something in the game had seized him completely, not the competition, not the social aspect, but the architecture of it, the way each position contained within it a constellation of futures, the way a single decision made 20 moves earlier could quietly determine the fate of everything that came after. By 14, he had read every book in his father's chess library twice. By 16, he had won his first-rated tournament. By 18, he had been described in a regional chess magazine as one of the most naturally gifted players the East Coast had produced in a decade. Then life had arrived, as it tends to, with its complications and its weight, and the boy who had once seemed destined for greatness had quietly stepped off the path that greatness required and chosen. Instead, to simply live. He had married young, loved deeply, and lost his wife to illness 6 years ago, a grief so complete that it had reorganized the entire architecture of his interior world. Sarah had been a schoolteacher, patient and luminous, the kind of woman who brought warmth into every room she entered the way a lamp brings light, not loudly, not with announcement, but as a fundamental change in the quality of the surrounding air. She had been the one who first told him, early in their marriage, that his gift for chess was not really about chess at all. It was about attention, she said. About the capacity to see what was actually there, rather than what you expected or hoped to find. He had carried that observation with him for the 6 years since her death, testing it against the world, finding it consistently true. He had raised his daughter, Lily, now 11, with the focused and tender devotion of a man who understood that the most important game he would ever play had nothing to do with chess. He worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm, steady work, not glamorous, the kind of job that paid the bills and left the evenings free. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn and drove a car that he'd bought used 4 years ago and had no particular plans to replace. He coached Lily's school chess club on Wednesday afternoons and made her breakfast every morning without exception and read to her on the nights she asked, which was most of them. He had returned to competitive chess quietly, the way a man returns to a language he never entirely forgot, playing online under an anonymous username in the evenings after Lily went to bed, finding in the familiar geometry of the board a piece that nothing else quite offered. In 4 years of online competition at the highest available rating levels, he had not lost a single match. Not one. Coaches and grandmasters who had encountered his games in digital archives had argued about his identity in forum threads and message boards, marveling at the precision and the unorthodox creativity of his play, unable to agree on who he was or where he had come from. Some had speculated he was a disgraced former professional playing undercover. Others believed he must be a young prodigy who had not yet entered public competition. The actual answer, a widowed data analyst from Brooklyn who made pancakes on Sunday mornings and helped his daughter with her science projects and had simply never stopped thinking about chess, would have struck most of them as too quiet to be true. Daniel had never clarified. He had no particular interest in being known. He sat at the back table of the Meridian Chess Club, a man invisible by choice, in a room that had decided he was invisible by default, and studied the board in front of him, with the quiet attention of someone who already understood, at a level deeper than thought, every possible conversation the pieces could have. The doors to the main hall swung open just before 8 o'clock, and Victoria Hale walked in. The change in the room was immediate and unmistakable, the way a shift in air pressure announces a change in weather before a single cloud appears. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Victoria Hale was 36 years old, the founder and CEO of Apex Digital Solutions, a technology company whose valuation had recently crossed the $14 billion mark for the second consecutive quarter. She had appeared on the covers of 3 major business magazines in the past 18 months alone. She was dressed in a charcoal Alexander McQueen suit with a silk blouse the color of champagne. Her dark hair swept back in a style that managed to look both effortless and precisely controlled. She moved through the room as though she owned it, which, in a meaningful sense, she did. Having been the club's primary patron for the past 3 years, a financial relationship that gave her opinions the weight of decree and her presence the quality of an occasion. People materialized around her. The club's director appeared at her elbow with a warm smile and a glass of sparkling water. Men she had never spoken to found reasons to be nearby, laughing a little too readily, angling for eye contact with the practiced subtlety of those who understood that proximity to power was itself a form of currency. Victoria accepted the attention with the ease of long habit, moving through the gathering like a current through water. Charming here, dismissive there, deploying warmth and coolness with the precision of someone who had learned exactly how much of each to show. She had clawed her way out of a middle-class Pittsburgh upbringing through a combination of ferocious intelligence, relentless work, and the early conviction formed young and never seriously challenged, since that the world sorted itself into those who won and those who didn't, and that the difference between the two categories was almost entirely the result of personal will and capability. It was a belief that her success had appeared to confirm at every turn, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind of belief to hold. She was passing near the tournament registration area when she noticed Daniel. He was hunched slightly over the board, not with the tension of anxiety, but with the natural inclination of someone deeply absorbed, one hand resting loosely on the table, his worn jacket catching the chandelier light, in a way that somehow emphasized every frayed thread. Victoria stopped. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has encountered something that doesn't belong in the composition, the way a curator might look at a misattributed painting hung in the wrong gallery. She tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying easily across the nearby tables. "Are you the maintenance staff?" "I've been meaning to mention the third-floor restroom." There was laughter, not universal, but present, and loud enough to matter. Daniel looked up. He met her gaze with an expression of such complete and genuine equanimity that it seemed, for just a fraction of a second, to give her pause. "I'm a player," he said simply. "I registered for the tournament tonight." Victoria's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "A player," she repeated, the word landing with the particular intonation that turns a statement into a commentary. She looked him up and down with a deliberateness that was clearly intended to be observed. "Well, that's brave." More laughter. Daniel said nothing. He looked back at the board. The exchange should have ended there. By any reasonable social calculus, it had run its course. But something about Daniel's composure, the complete absence of wounded pride, the lack of any visible scramble toward dignity, seemed to act on Victoria Hale like a splinter she couldn't stop pressing. She lingered. She asked, with the affectation of idle curiosity, what he did for work. When someone nearby relayed that he was a data analyst, her expression arranged itself into an expression of polite condescension that required no translation. "And a single father, I'm told," she said. "How admirable. It must be difficult, managing all of that." The word difficult carried its full payload of implied hierarchy. The room had gathered at this point, not ostentatiously, but in the organic way that groups of people consolidate around the gravity of spectacle, conversations dimming, attention sharpening. Daniel set down the piece he had been examining. He looked at Victoria with the considered patience of a man who had long since made his peace with the world's tendency to assign value in the crudest possible terms. "Money isn't the only measure," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. It was not an argument. It was simply a statement of a position he held, offered without heat or expectation. Victoria Hale laughed a sharp, bright sound that carried a great deal of information about the assumptions it rested on. "That is exactly what people say," she replied, "when they don't have any." The room's response was divided. Some laughed, some shifted uncomfortably, some watched with the carefully neutral expressions of people who have learned not to choose sides too quickly. Victoria was enjoying herself. She had not particularly planned to engage with this man when she walked in, but the encounter had acquired its own momentum, and she found herself unwilling to disengage while his composure remained so fundamentally intact. She looked around at the assembled crowd, the investors, the executives, the journalists from the business press who covered these events, and something crystallized in her. A gesture. An object lesson. She turned back to Daniel and raised her voice to a pitch that left no one in any doubt that what followed was intended for the entire room. "Let's make this interesting," she said. She smiled the smile of someone about to do something generous on their own terms. "One game. If you win, I will write you a check for $1 million tonight. Right here, in front of everyone." She paused for effect. "And if I win, and I will win, you stand up in front of everyone in this room and tell them exactly what you told me. That money isn't the only measure of success. I want to hear you say it in a room where it might actually mean something." The silence that followed was absolute. $1 million, said aloud, in a room full of people for whom the figure was not inconceivable, but was still startling in its bluntness. It carried the weight of theater. Every face turned to Daniel. He did not move immediately. He sat for a moment that felt longer than it was, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his gaze moving from the board to some middle distance that no one else in the room could see. He was not, in that moment, calculating odds. He was not thinking about the money, not the winning of it, not the losing of it. He was thinking about Lily, who had asked him that morning over breakfast whether he thought there were people in the world who believed their money made them better than other people, and whom he had told, honestly, that yes, some people did believe that, and that the best response to such people was not anger but patience and the quiet insistence of simply being exactly who you were. He thought about the 4 years of evenings at the board, the 10,000 hours of silent, private study. He thought about what it meant to know something deeply and to have never felt the need to announce it. He looked up at Victoria Hale and said, "All right, I'll play." The room erupted. Not in the organized way of a sporting crowd, but in the disorganized, electric way of people who have just witnessed something they weren't expecting and are still processing its implications. A journalist from a local business publication had been in the room covering the monthly tournament as a social item. She now raised her camera and began shooting in earnest. Marcus, the host, moved quickly to formalize the arrangement: a fresh board, proper tournament pieces, a timekeeper. 2 chairs were positioned facing each other at the main table, which was illuminated by the best light in the room. People pressed forward, rearranging themselves into the rough shape of an audience. The air had changed entirely. The evening had found its event. Victoria Hale sat down with the settled confidence of someone occupying a throne that had been built specifically for her dimensions. She had, in fact, a genuinely impressive chess resume for an amateur. She had won the Northeast Regional Business Chess Championship for 3 consecutive years, a competitive field, populated largely by people who played seriously and trained regularly. She had studied with a professional coach for 2 years during her late 20s, a period when she had decided that mastering chess would be a useful discipline for the kind of strategic thinking her business required. She understood the game at a level that far exceeded the casual player. She knew theory, she knew endgame technique, and she possessed the kind of competitive intensity that transformed intellectual understanding into applied ferocity. She had beaten men who underestimated her, which was most of them, and she had found a particular satisfaction in those victories that went beyond the game itself. She opened aggressively a King's Indian attack, played with the confidence of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan, each move placed with a precision that drew audible appreciation from the crowd. Within the first 8 moves, she had established a strong central presence, developed her pieces with textbook efficiency, and created the kind of structural pressure that forces opponents into reactive rather than creative play. The commentator, a local chess teacher named Gerald, who had been roped into providing color for the gathering audience, leaned toward the microphone that someone had produced from somewhere and noted, with audible admiration, that the position strongly favored the player in the McQueen suit. Daniel played. He played calmly, without hurry, making each move with the unhurried deliberation of someone engaged in a private conversation rather than a public contest. He offered no readable expression. He did not lean forward or back. His hand moved to the piece, lifted it, placed it, withdrew. For the first 15 minutes, to every observer in the room, he appeared to be doing nothing in particular, responding without urgency, ceding space in ways that looked like passivity, building a position that looked, to the untrained eye, like the position of someone managing a slow and polite retreat. Victoria played on with growing confidence. She made a joke at one point, something about how she hoped Daniel wasn't planning to resign early because she wanted the full experience of the victory. People laughed. She was expansive, demonstrative, inhabiting the performance of dominance as naturally as she inhabited everything else. She had always played chess the way she conducted business, with aggression at the front, a clearly declared intention, the confidence of someone who believed that the person who moves first and moves boldly controls the shape of everything that follows. It was a style that had served her extraordinarily well in competitive amateur circles, where most opponents encountered the aggression and either matched it poorly or collapsed under its pressure. She had never, in any chess context she had yet occupied, faced a player who responded to aggression by making it into a mirror. After 17 minutes, she executed a deep central advance that threatened to split Daniel's position entirely, and Gerald, the commentator, said, with genuine sympathy in his voice, that the gentleman in the charcoal jacket was facing a very difficult set of choices. Then Daniel sacrificed his queen. He lifted the most powerful piece on the board, his queen, the piece whose loss signals, in the understanding of most players, the beginning of the end. and placed it directly in the path of Victoria's most aggressive bishop. Not carelessly, not desperately, but with the quiet deliberateness of a man placing the final piece in an arrangement he has been constructing for a very long time. The room went silent. Then, half a beat later, it erupted in the opposite direction, laughter, the kind that carries a complex mixture of disbelief and condescension, the sound of a room deciding collectively that it has just witnessed a mistake too large to survive. He gave away his queen, someone said, loudly enough for the room to hear. Victoria stared at the board for a moment, then looked up at Daniel with an expression of such unconcealed pity that it drew more laughter. "I almost feel badly," she said. She took the queen. She leaned back in her chair with the satisfied posture of someone who has just closed a deal. Several audience members began to gather their coats. Gerald, the commentator, searching for something constructive to say, offered that the sacrifice might have been an attempt to complicate the position, but that, in his assessment, it was, regrettably, insufficient. One of the men who had laughed at Daniel's jacket when he walked in began telling the person next to him about another chess match he had once witnessed, in which an underdog had surprised everyone as a way of being charitable without yet committing to hope. But not everyone was laughing. In the far corner of the room, in a high-backed chair that he had occupied for the past 40 minutes, with the stillness of a man accustomed to observing rather than being observed, sat Raymond Castile. He was 71 years old, a former world championship contender whose peak rating had placed him among the 50 best players on the planet in the 1980s, a man who had spent 50 years inside the game, and whose understanding of chess positions had become, over that time, something closer to a second language than a learned skill. He had been invited to the evening as a guest of Marcus, and had spent most of it watching the room rather than the boards, the way old lions watch a savanna they no longer need to hunt. When Victoria made her challenge, he had moved his chair slightly closer to the main table and settled in to watch with the quality of attention he reserved for things that genuinely interested him. He had been watching Daniel since the third move. When the queen sacrifice landed, Raymond Castile did not laugh. He did not reach for his coat. He rose from his chair with the unhurried urgency of a man who has recognized something that demands to be addressed, crossed to the main table, and stood over the board with his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes moving across the position with the rapid, absorbing intensity of someone reading a sentence they cannot believe they have found. He studied the board for nearly a full minute. Then he looked up at Daniel. "The Mercer trap," he said. His voice was low, but the room had gone quiet enough that everyone heard it. He looked at Daniel with the expression of a man encountering a ghost he had always half believed in. "Is it you? Are you actually him?" The room stirred. People looked at each other. Victoria Hale, who had been accepting congratulations from a small group who had gathered prematurely around her side of the table, looked up with a slight frown. Daniel met Raymond's Chaza and Chav. After a moment, a single slow nod. Raymond Castile exhaled a long breath through his nose, looked back at the board, and said, "To no one in particular, and everyone assembled, God help her." The story that Raymond told, in fragments, to the confused and increasingly riveted audience, was this. 20 years earlier, a teenage prodigy from Queens had appeared in the competitive chess world like a force of nature, winning tournaments with a style so unusual and so comprehensively effective that coaches and grandmasters had struggled to categorize it. The boy, Daniel Mercer, had developed a suite of strategic approaches that bore no clean resemblance to existing opening theory approaches that appeared, on the surface, to be passive and positionally weak, and that turned out, 20 moves deep, to be traps of almost incomprehensible sophistication, arrangements that looked like accidents until the moment they became inescapable. Raymond himself had played a training game against a 17-year-old Daniel at a regional qualifier and had sat afterward, staring at the board for 20 minutes, reconstructing how he had ended up completely constrained by a position he had believed, 20 moves prior, that he was winning. He had described it to colleagues afterward as the most unsettling chess experience of his career, not because the boy had been aggressive, but because he had been so deeply, completely patient, as though he could see the end of the game from the opening moves and was simply guiding events toward a conclusion he had already determined. The chess community had called it the Mercer trap, not because it was a single technique, but because it described a philosophy. Let your opponent believe they are winning. Give them every reason to believe it, remove from them all cause for doubt or caution, and then, when they are fully committed to the position you have built for them, close the door. Then, at the age of 22, with a rating that placed him among the top players in the country, and a future that every serious observer agreed would take him wherever he chose to go, Daniel Mercer had simply stopped. No announcement. No final tournament. No explanation. He had left the game as quietly as weather leaves a room when a window closes. The chess world had wondered about him for years, and then, gradually, had come to treat him as one of its great what-ifs. The talent that had dissolved before anyone could properly measure it. He had been here, in Brooklyn, raising his daughter and playing online, under a name no one recognized, accumulating a record of unbroken victory that the community had attributed, in various forum threads, to a mysterious and brilliant anonymous master whose identity no one could establish. The debates had gone on for years, across specialist forums and chess analysis communities, the theories multiplying and contradicting each other with the particular fervor that attaches to a mystery that feels like it should have an obvious solution and persistently refuses to produce one. One prominent analyst had constructed a long, detailed argument that the anonymous master was a Russian prodigy, deliberately obscuring his identity to delay recruitment by professional circuits. Another had argued, with equal conviction, that the games bore the hallmarks of a retired professional who had found in anonymous competition a freedom unavailable to those playing under their real names. Both were wrong in every particular, and right in the general spirit of the thing, which was that the person they were looking for was someone who had chosen, entirely deliberately, to keep the most extraordinary part of himself private, for reasons that had nothing to do with evasion, and everything to do with the specific freedom that comes from doing excellent work in rooms that are too quiet for anyone else to hear. The anonymous master, it turned out, was a data analyst in a worn charcoal jacket, sitting at a mahogany table in the Meridian Chess Club, 50 moves into dismantling the chess game of a $14 billion technology executive with a philosophical precision that was, if you knew how to look at it, staggering in its beauty. Victoria Hale was beginning to understand that something had gone wrong. She stared at the board with the focused, slightly wild expression of someone running calculations that keep returning results she hasn't planned for. The position she had believed, 15 minutes ago, was a foregone conclusion had transformed into something unrecognizable. She had spent 12 years building a company on the premise that she was the smartest person in any given room, and that premise had been validated so consistently by so many rooms that she had stopped treating it as a hypothesis and had started treating it as a law of nature. The board in front of her was doing something that laws of nature were not supposed to do. It was refusing to behave. Daniel's pieces, which had appeared scattered and passive, had consolidated into a configuration that was, she now saw, blocking every meaningful avenue of advance she had left. Her bishop, the piece she had used to take the queen, the capture she had made with such confident satisfaction, was pinned behind a pawn structure that had materialized like a closing hand around her wrist. Her rooks were separated. Her king, which she had not worried about because she had been so entirely focused on attack, was exposed in a way that was now, she could see, not coincidental. Every weakness in her position had been present since move 12. She had been looking at a trap for 30 minutes and had seen only a victory. Her hands, which normally moved with the decisive authority that had made her famous in negotiating rooms and boardrooms alike, began to hover over pieces and withdraw without committing. She moved a knight, and then spent 2 full minutes staring at the consequences before reaching for it again. Gerald, the commentator, who had reversed his earlier assessment with the enthusiasm of someone released from an obligation to be wrong, was now speaking in a rapid, excited undertone about the specific genius of the positional construction he was observing, gesturing at the board as he narrated developments to the crowd, which had reconsolidated entirely, and was now watching with the quality of attention that belongs to moments people know they will describe to other people for years afterward. The man who had suggested earlier that Daniel was catering staff was very quiet. The cluster of people who had laughed at the Queen's sacrifice were watching the board with the careful blankness of faces that have rearranged themselves away from an expression they now regret. Victoria played on, because there was nothing else to do. Each move she made was met with Daniel's response unhurried, quiet, precisely placed, and each response closed a door she had not known was open. She was not a person accustomed to the experience of finding that a room had been built around her, without her awareness. Her entire professional life had been premised on the idea that she was the one who built the rooms, who designed the terms, who determined the shape of the spaces other people moved through, to discover that she had, from the first move of this game, been moving through a space that someone else had designed with meticulous and total foresight. It was not merely a chess experience. It was an epistemological event. Move 43. Daniel moved his rook. The position on the board was not immediately obvious to most of the people watching. But Raymond Castile, who was standing close enough to the table that he could have touched it, drew a slow, quiet breath and went very still. Gerald, the commentator, leaned forward, stared for 5 full seconds, and then sat back with an expression of a man who has just read the last paragraph of a book and found that it resolves everything he had not understood. Victoria looked at the board. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that the room began to understand that she was no longer searching for a move but absorbing the finality of a position that had no good answers remaining within it. Her king had 1 square. Every other square was covered. The path to every escape had been closed, quietly and methodically, so many moves ago that tracing back to the moment it had become inevitable felt like trying to find the first second of a river. She reached for her king. She tipped it over. The room went silent in the particular way that rooms do when something important has just been decided, not merely a game, but a proposition about the world and what it actually measures when it measures a person. For 2, perhaps 3 seconds, there was nothing in the Meridian Chess Club but the soft sound of the fallen king rolling very slightly on the polished wood of the tabletop, and 40-something people collectively adjusting their understanding of the evening they had just witnessed. Then the applause began, and once it began, it built with the force of something that had been held back and was now being released, and the room was filled with the sound of people who had watched something extraordinary and were acknowledging it in the only way available to them. Daniel Mercer did not raise his arms. He did not stand. He sat for a moment in the same position he had occupied for the past hour, his hands folded loosely on the table, looking at the board with the expression of a man reviewing a completed piece of work, satisfied, but privately, in the way that belongs entirely to the person who made the thing. Raymond Castile put a hand on his shoulder and said something that only Daniel could hear. Gerald, the commentator, was narrating with the breathless quality of someone who understands that they are participating in a story they will tell for the rest of their life. The journalist from the business publication was photographing everything: the board, the fallen king, Daniel's face, Victoria's face, the room. Victoria Hale sat across the table and looked at the board and did not move. Someone nearby said something to her, and she did not respond. She was not performing devastation. It was not a theatrical moment for her, the way the challenge had been. This was something quieter and more fundamental. The specific experience of a person confronting the evidence that a belief they have organized their world around is not as complete as they had believed it to be. She had looked at Daniel Mercer, and she had seen a man defined entirely by what he lacked: money, status, the visible markers of success that her world had agreed upon, and she had not only been wrong, she had been spectacularly, publicly, irrefutably wrong in a way that had unfolded in front of 40 witnesses with cameras. People began approaching Daniel. They wanted to know who he was, where he had come from, why he had left the competitive circuit, why he had never told anyone in the club who he was. He answered the questions that seemed worth answering, briefly and without embellishment, and declined, gently, to answer the ones that seemed more interested in spectacle than substance. When a woman who had been among those laughing at the Queen's sacrifice asked him why he had never said anything earlier in the evening, when the comments began, why he had not simply told them who he was, Daniel looked at her for a moment and said, "The people who needed to know who I was already knew. Everyone else would find out eventually." He said it without bitterness. He said it the way a man states a thing he has understood for a long time. Victoria Hale stood. The room noticed immediately, and a slight hush redistributed itself across the gathering as people recognized that something further was about to happen. She walked around the table to where Daniel was still seated and stood before him with a directness that was, in its way, its own form of courage. The confident performance of the evening had been stripped away and what remained was a woman standing in front of a room full of people acknowledging a debt, not merely a financial one. She said, and her voice was clear and did not waver, "I owe you an apology before I owe you anything else. I treated you in a way that had nothing to do with who you are and everything to do with assumptions I made about what you looked like. That was wrong. I'm sorry." The room was absolutely still. She reached into her jacket, produced her phone, and with the decisive efficiency of a person accustomed to making large financial transactions, completed the transfer. $1 million. Exactly as promised. She turned her phone so that Daniel could see the confirmation screen and then put it back in her pocket. Daniel looked at the screen. He nodded. Once. And then he did something that no one in the room had anticipated, including Raymond Castile, who had thought he understood Daniel Mercer fairly well. He said, "Thank you. I have some ideas about what I'd like to do with it." Over the following weeks, the details would emerge. Daniel donated the majority of the money, $850,000, to a nonprofit initiative he had already been quietly supporting, a program that operated free chess instruction in under-resourced public schools across New York City and 3 neighboring states. The remaining portion went into a dedicated fund for his daughter's education. He kept nothing for himself beyond what he had walked in with that evening, which was the same worn jacket, the same dark trousers, and the same quality of interior calm that had made him invisible to the people who had looked at him and seen only what was absent. When this decision became known in the room, Gerald had overheard the conversation about the chess program and relayed it to the assembled crowd with the quality of someone announcing a verdict. The applause that followed was different from the applause that had greeted the checkmate. That had been the applause of surprise. This was something else. Several people who had laughed at the catering joke were looking at the floor. One of the hedge fund associates was visibly calculating something in his expression that had nothing to do with numbers. Victoria Hale, who had watched Daniel speak about the donation with the composed matter-of-factness of someone describing a plan he had held in mind for some time, stood very still and said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked him the question that had been forming since the moment she tipped over her king. "Why didn't you retaliate?" "You had every reason to. I humiliated you in front of a room full of people. You could have said something when I walked in. You could have said something when I made the bet. Why did you just—" She paused, searching for the word. "Let it happen?" Daniel looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given the bored patient. Unrushed, genuinely considering. "Winning isn't about defeating other people," he said. "Not really. The best win you can get is the one where the other person walks away better than they came in. I wasn't playing against you tonight. I was playing with you." The slight emphasis on the preposition carried a great deal of freight. Victoria absorbed it. Her expression moved through several things in quick succession, and then settled into something that looked, beneath its surface, like the beginning of a question she had not previously known how to ask. The room held that moment the way rooms hold, the moments that define them collectively. In the specific atmospheric pressure of shared witness, the knowledge that something had happened here that would be carried out in the memories of everyone present, and set down as a kind of landmark in the ongoing account of what people were to each other, and what they owed each other, and what the world actually meant when it sorted itself into winners and losers. Raymond Castile, who had seen more chess in 70 years than most people would encounter in multiple lifetimes, stood near the window with a glass of water, and said to no one in particular that the Mercer trap was more elegant than he remembered. Which was saying something considerable. Daniel Mercer gathered his coat. He stood, shook hands with Raymond, thanked Marcus the host with the quiet courtesy he brought to all his interactions, and moved toward the elevator. People stepped aside as he passed, not the hurried, uncomfortable stepping aside of people making way for someone whose presence makes them uncertain, but the deliberate, respectful stepping aside of an audience acknowledging that the person moving through them has demonstrated something they will be thinking about for a long time. The journalist called after him for a comment. He paused at the elevator doors, turned back, and said, in a voice loud enough for the room, "Tell people that the most important things you know about yourself are the ones you never have to announce." The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. Victoria Hale stood in the middle of the room he had just left. Surrounded by the architecture of an evening she had arrived intending to dominate, and looked at the space where Daniel Mercer had been with the expression of someone staring at a door through which a very important question has just walked out, and understanding, for the first time, with the full force of the understanding, that the answer to that question about what a person is worth, about what constitutes evidence of a life well lived, about what it means to be genuinely formidable, had been sitting at a back table, in a worn charcoal jacket from the moment the evening began. The applause, when it came again, was spontaneous and unanimous. It filled the room, the way conviction fills a person who has just arrived at a truth they cannot unlearn. Outside, 43 floors below, the city continued its restless, glittering accounting of itself, tallying its worth in square footage and stock prices, and the length of waiting lists for tables at restaurants whose names carried social weight. Daniel Mercer stepped out onto the sidewalk into the cool October air, turned toward the subway entrance, and walked home to Brooklyn, to relieve the babysitter, and check on Lily, who he knew would be asleep with one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress, in the way she had slept since she was 3 years old, and which still, every time he saw it, filled him with a tenderness that no other experience in his life could approximate. He took the stairs up to their apartment, 2 at a time. He eased the door open quietly. Lily was asleep, arm hanging as predicted, the soft light from the hallway catching her face in a way that made her look, as she always did in sleep, like every version of herself at once the baby she had been, the young woman she was becoming, the particular and irreplaceable person she already was. She had, on her bedside table, a chessboard that Daniel had set up for her the previous weekend, with a mid-game problem she was working through, a position he had pulled from one of his old annotated books and simplified to her current level. She had been studying it in the evenings before she fell asleep, penciling possible moves into a small notebook in her careful, deliberate handwriting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, and felt the absolute, unleveraged, undefeatable richness of the life he had built in the only currency that had ever seemed to him entirely trustworthy. He straightened the blanket she had kicked off one foot and turned off the small lamp on her desk that she had left burning. He went to his desk, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the materials for the chess program. There were 17 new schools on the waiting list. He made a note to call the program director in the morning, somewhere across the city, in a penthouse apartment with views that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. Victoria Hale sat at a desk of her own and stared at a blank document on her screen for a long time. She had, in the past 12 hours, lost $1 million, lost a chess match, and lost something harder to name the particular unchallenged certainty that the story she had been telling about how the world worked was complete. She was beginning to understand that it was not. She opened a search window and typed in the name of the free chess program that a man in a worn jacket had decided was worth more than $1 million. She read for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her assistant and said, in a voice that was quieter and less armored than her usual register, "I want to make a donation to a nonprofit. I'll send you the details in the morning. It should be significant. Make sure it's anonymous." She hung up. She looked at the blank document again. After a while, she began to type. There are people the world has decided are not worth noticing. And there are people who have decided the world's opinion of their worth is not the final word on the matter. The distance between those two positions is not money, and it is not status. And it is not the sum of the visible things that rooms full of important people have agreed to treat as evidence. It is something older and quieter and more durable than any of that. It is the knowledge, held privately and with complete conviction, of who you are and what you have given yourself to and what you are capable of, independent of whether the room you walk into has any idea. The man in the worn jacket knew. He had always known. He had never needed anyone else to confirm it. And the most extraordinary thing about him, the thing that no one who was in that room on a Thursday evening in late October would ever quite stop thinking about, was not the unbroken record, and not the 4 years of quiet, undeclared mastery, and not even the precision of the trap that had been set from the very first move of the game. It was the fact that when he had been given a room full of people to prove something to, he had chosen, instead, to prove it only to himself, in the way he had always proven it, at a board in a quiet apartment in Brooklyn, in the evenings, after his daughter went to bed. That is the only kind of winning that cannot be taken from you. The kind that asks nothing of the audience. The kind that exists entirely in the quality of the work, and in the quality of the life that surrounds it, and in the particular, unhurried, undefeatable peace of a person who has never once confused the opinion of the room with the truth of who they are. Never judge a person by the coat they wear, or the car they drive, or the number that appears on a screen when their account is opened, because sometimes the person the room decided not to notice is the one carrying the weight of the room's education quietly, patiently, without a word of announcement and waiting, with all the time in the world, for the board to tell the rest of the story.